What's up, guys? My name is Weston Zink, and I am your host here at the Self-Actualized Man. I am going to be behind the screen for this emergency broadcast of the culture war. The American Psychological Association recently released a groundbreaking 36-page guideline report highlighting the harmful and dangerous aspects of traditional masculinity, which some call toxic masculinity. In this episode of the Culture War, we are going to cover some of the important findings contained within the APA's guideline, how the media has been spinning these guidelines for public consumption, and why these guidelines have the potential to be extremely dangerous for all boys and men. So let's get right into it because we have a lot to cover in this episode today. So first and foremost, we have to understand what the American Psychological Association is and the power they have in the field of mental health and psychology. So the American Psychological Association, according to their website, they aspire to excel as valuable, effective, and influential organization, advancing psychology as a science. The American Psychological Association was founded in 1892 with 31 members and grew quickly after World War II. Today, the APA has more than 115,700 members and 54 divisions in subfields of psychology. We aspire to excel as a valuable, effective, and influential organization, advancing psychology as a science. Our strategic goal includes expanding psychology's role in advancing health and increasing recognition of psychology as a science. So we go on to look at more about the APA to figure out who these people really are. Their mission is to advance the creation, communication, and application of psychological knowledge to benefit society and improve people's lives. The APA does this by encouraging the development and application of psychology in the broadest manner, promoting research in psychology, the improvement of research methods and conditions, and the application of research findings, improving the qualifications and usefulness of psychologists by establishing high standards of ethics, conduct, education, and achievement, and lastly, increasing and disseminating psychological knowledge through meetings, professional contacts, papers, discussions, and publication. So really quickly, these are the main purposes of the APA. So they do a lot of research. They are the research arm of the mental health field. They also want to improve psychologists' qualification and adhere to their standards of practice and also guidelines, and that's what we'll be talking about. And also increasing and disseminating psychological knowledge, meaning they get their work out there. They do a lot of education, they do a lot of programs, workshops, trainings for professionals as well as for the people that they serve. So the APA has 54 subdivisions contained within its organization. That's 54 separate psychological divisions spread throughout the entire field of psychology who are subject to the APA's governing authority. Let's take a quick look at what some of these APA subdivisions are. So you can see here we have your educational psychologies, military psychologies, psychologies in public service, aging and development. Here's your psychopharmacology and substance use. So here's a lot of drug research right here. We have behavioral analysis that is a part of the APA. We have clinical neuropsychology, health psychology. So these are all of these broad subdivisions that are under the governance of the APA. And one in particular I want to highlight is this one right here, school psychology. So nearly every single public school within the United States has at least one school psychologist. Now, why is this important? Well, the school psychologists, their role is and responsibility is to not only conduct research on issues facing the public school system, but also to implement workshops, trainings, and behavioral programs to get certain results, whatever they want to accomplish. So these are in the entire school system. So just one subdivision of the APA, school psychology, has a wide expanse throughout the entire public education system. And it was also school psychologists who were instrumental in the implementation of Common Core. That is the new teaching methods and guides that the entire Department of Education has adopted. So while 115,000 members may not seem like a lot, one must keep in mind the members of the APA are in leading scientific positions within the field of psychology, so they do hold positions of power and authority in major social, clinical, and educational institutions. So we can see that based on the APA's mission itself, that they do indeed cover quite a large swath of the entire field of psychology, which is, again, divided roughly between areas of research and then areas of clinical application or practice. The American Psychological Association has a sister organization known as the American Psychiatric Association. Again, these are the governing bodies for all psychologists and psychiatrists in the United States. Both have the power to establish policy, procedures, and protocols for treatment, training, and testing for the entire mental health field, as decisions often trickle down into lesser organizations within the field. And these are also the two organizations who are behind the creation of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, which is the mental health Bible, so to speak, for all psychiatric diagnosis and mental health diagnoses. And it forms the backbone for the entire mental health system, as all clinicians and health insurance companies utilize the DSM-5. Again, the APA's power and influence are significant. Therefore, the potential implications these guidelines can have for boys and men all across the United States are also significant. So we go to the APA's Twitter page here, and we see that starting on the 7th of January, they start to, and moving forward, they start to tweet a whole bunch of messages about these guidelines that were released. Now, these APA guidelines, which are titled as APA Guidelines for the Psychological Practice with Boys and Men, were actually published in August 2018, but they weren't publicly released until about the 7th of January 2019. And as we can see, since its public release, we see a slew of subsequent tweets and retweets from the APA citing and promoting their newly published guideline. Now, I think they do cite some legitimate issues facing boys and men alike, such as research shows that boys and men are at a disproportionate risk for school discipline, academic challenges, health disparities, and other quality of life issues. Well, yeah, I absolutely agree with the APA here, but it's not for the reasons that they postulate in their guideline. We also see here as another tweet that the APA states, research shows that many men do not seek help when needed, and many report barriers to receiving gender-sensitive psychological treatment. And again, down here, they cite the guidelines, which you can go and read and highly recommend. Well, again, this is because the treatment or clinical side of the mental health field is predominantly female. And this is not to say that it's wrong or bad for men to see a female therapist for therapy or females to be therapists, but many men might never receive a much-needed masculine contrast figure, since counseling psychology, again, is overwhelmingly female, which, by the way, includes elementary and adolescent boys in the school system, which is another femme-centric system. So yeah, I absolutely agree with the APA here that many boys and men are not getting gender-sensitive treatment because there is a severe deficit of positive male contact, mentorship, and role models for boys and men, both within the field of psychology as well as outside of it. Now, I'm curious as to why the APA is publicly releasing these guidelines and how they might intend to apply them, since these guidelines typically aren't released to the public. Part of me wants to believe that this might be part of a social experiment. You know, the APA does indeed hold a lot of researchers in their organization to see how the public will react to their guidelines, to anticipate any potential public pushback they might experience before they fully implement them into practice. I also believe another reason the APA publicly released these guidelines could be to prepare the public to accept traditional or conventional masculinity as a mental health issue, as a mental disorder, and a public health crisis in need of a cure. Now, let's take a look at how mainstream media is spinning the APA's release of these guidelines. So the initial NBC News was the initial agency that first picked up the APA's release of the guidelines, and of course you can tell clearly from the title of this article, American Psychological Association links masculinity ideology to homophobia and misogyny. It goes on to say that masculinity ideology, and this will be an important concept we will be defining here and breaking down later on, is linked to the ideology to homophobia, bullying, and sexual harassment. It goes on to say that men who benefit from their social power or privilege are also oppressed and confined to this toxic masculinity. I want to highlight this particular part in the article where it states, reports argue that some of the psychological and social problems that disproportionately affect men may be in part because they are, quote, less likely to be diagnosed with internalizing disorders such as depression, in part because internalizing disorders do not conform to traditional gender role stereotypes about men's emotionality. So it's partially saying here that this traditional masculinity ideology causes men to internalize certain emotions or disorders, in this case utilizing depression, and this causes a whole host of dysfunction. Again, an important piece I want to highlight too, also both in this article as well as in the guidelines, is that the APA uses the social constructionist definition of gender. So it goes on to say that the APA recognizes that masculinities are constructed based on social, cultural, and contextual norms, understanding the impact of power, privilege, and sexism on the development of boys and men and on their relationships with others, and reduce the high rates of problems boys and men face and act out in their lives, such as aggression, violence, substance use, and suicide. We go on to a next article from ABC that states in the title tag, in the hashtag MeToo age, APA has new guidelines for psychologists talking about traditional masculinity. And what I want to highlight in this article is this part right here is they start off saying, how is a man supposed to act? What is masculinity and when does it become toxic? And how should psychologists approach the concept of masculinity when seeing patients? These are questions an increasing number of psychologists must consider as dialogue around toxic masculinity, sexual abuse and harassment, and the hashtag MeToo movement continues across the country. Most recently, an ad for the razor company Gillette prompted many men to throw away their Gillette products in a defensive protest. The ad asked men to be better, to stand against toxic masculinity, and stop excusing sexual harassment, bullying, and fighting as boys will be boys. And that Gillette article, that Gillette ad was released several days after the APA publicly published these guidelines. So the ABC News article also goes on to state that these guidelines are not anti-masculinity because the APA's view is more nuanced. So it goes on to say that Mick Kelly said that the APA's tweets was viewed as a definitive stance against masculinity, which because it is, when the APA actually sees masculinity as multifaceted, which it is. Unfortunately, the guidelines came out, the tweet said something about traditional masculinity being harmful, and what we saw was the people latched onto that, and it got out of hand, he said. Leadership abilities, confidence, assertiveness, and courage, these are all aspects of traditional masculinity that are positive, healthy, and pro-social in most circumstances, McKelly said. However, he also said that when these qualities are taken to their extremes, like many other behaviors and attitudes, they can cause problems. Well, duh. When anything is taken to extreme, it often causes more problems than it solves. The APA also released a podcast here from the expert Wisdom Powell, PhD, titled Speaking of Psychology, How Masculinity Can Hurt Mental Health. It says the availability of quality of care is often substandard when it comes to serving low-income boys and men in the ethnic and minority communities. As a result, they have some of the worst health outcomes in the country. And in this episode, psychologist Wisdom Powell, PhD and talks about how racism, discrimination, and gender stereotyping can contribute to a decline in men's health over time. So basically, this woman will break down in the 16-minute, 30-second episode how masculinity is harming the mental health of boys and men and society all around. And the fakest of the fake news media, CNN, highlights in their article is psychologist and Gillette are right about traditional masculinity. The CNN goes on to say that it is also possible, though, that received expectations of men hurt men. That's the conclusion of new guidelines for treating men and boys published by the American Psychological Association. According to the APA, traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful. They're right. Forcing men to behave in accordance with the worst stereotypes of manliness harms them and harms others. So again, we can see traditional masculinity is harmful to self and harmful to others and society as a whole. CNN goes on to state that ideas about traditional masculinity especially harm people from marginalized groups who don't conform to ideal or stereotypes. Of course, these are what they're pointing out is the transgender, genderqueer population as these marginalized groups. CNN goes on to state here that the APA isn't saying all traditionally masculine traits are bad. An article on the APA's website summarizing these guidelines points out that context matters, which they actually do not point out in the actual guidelines that context matters. It goes on to say anyone of any gender may benefit from competitiveness on the sports field or on the corporate ladder or from stoicism in a crisis. Feminists encourage girls and women to embrace supposedly masculine traits like self-confidence, assertiveness, physical confidence, and a willingness to stand up for oneself and others. Those traits can be valuable for men too, just as everyone can benefit from traditionally feminine traits like being emotionally open and caring. So again, here in this paragraph, in and of itself, we can see how not only is CNN and the radical feminists and now the APA is what it seems like they're trying to invert the genders. They're trying to invert the masculine and feminine archetypes. And this last piece from CNN I want to highlight before we move forward is it goes to, you would think that advocates for men would be pleased that the APA is trying to understand and address the difficulties which men particularly face, that corporations like Procter & Gamble, which own Gillette, are doing the same. But instead, some have threatened to boycott Gillette, while some conservatives who claim to speak for men have reacted to the APA guidelines with outrage. Yeah, because both the Gillette article, the Gillette ad, and these APA guidelines are highly dangerous, and they are speaking of a mentality that is trying to prepare the public that masculinity, again, is an inherent evil. It is a public health crisis. It is a mental health issue. It is bad, and it needs to change. It is clear that the mainstream media and the American Psychological Association view traditional or conventional masculinity as pathological and dangerous, that toxic masculinity is a public health crisis and responsible for all the sexual assault and harassment and sexism, violence, homophobia, bullying, and the oppressive patriarchy, that boys and men are being indoctrinated into a dangerous masculinity ideology, which the APA describes as a set of descriptive, prescriptive, and proscriptive cognitions about boys and men, with a constellation of standards that have held sway over large segments of the population, including anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness, and adventure, risk, and violence. Now, I want to break this down because this definition of masculinity ideology is absolutely fundamental to the APA's guideline. So, first and foremost, basically masculinity ideology is how men and women describe both masculinity and the conventions and social rules specifying what behavior men ought or ought not to engage in. Like, men ought to be the first to approach a woman, and he ought not to rape her. Or men ought to be the one who pays for a date with a woman, and he ought not to question a woman's choices, especially her sexual choices. But what I disagree with consistently throughout these guidelines is the APA ignores fundamental biological and social differences between men and women, as there are well-founded and stark contrasts in the physical and psychological makeup between males and females. And the APA does not discriminate how or even that men relate to women and each other differently. So I want to break down some of the concepts the APA has defined as masculinity ideology, as the concepts are, again, fundamental to the APA's new guideline. So let's start off with this first piece right here, anti-femininity. What does anti-femininity mean? Does this mean a man who disagrees with a woman? Does this mean a man who genuinely hates women? Does this mean a man who disagrees with women? Does this mean a man who has sex with a lot of women and views women as sexual objects? I don't know, since the APA doesn't actually define what anti-femininity means. So I'm guessing they're probably using the feminist definition of anti-femininity, which of course is vague and generally applied as a man who expresses a disagreement with or an abject opinion of women's behavior or feminism, regardless of its validity, is an anti-feminine or misogynist. This other part right here, this achievement as part of masculinity ideology. I have never once in my life worked with or even met a man who did not want to succeed and achieve his life endeavors. We all want to achieve our goals, both as men and women. And we men derive a sense of achievement from accomplishing difficult tasks. It's something deeply fulfilling when you do something challenging that tests your skills, intellect, discipline, and courage, especially those impossible tasks that stretch every fiber of your mind and body to the breaking point, and you succeed. The arena where men test their abilities and derive a sense of achievement, of course, is quite various. And yeah, some guys use personal achievements as some sort of ego boost, and it is what it is. Other men derive a deep meaning and purpose when they put their mind and bodies to the test. So what I don't like about the APA's spin on achievement here as part of masculinity ideology is they pathologize it as something negative or bad that leaves less successful men oppressed and dysfunctional because they are unwilling or unable to achieve great things themselves. And this is just a fact of life. There's just things that I have achieved in life that some people won't, and there's things I haven't achieved in this life that some people will. It's just the way life goes. This part, eschewal of the appearance of weaknesses, is again a part of masculinity ideology. Well, weakness means lacking strength or a person that is unable to resist temptation. What the APA seemingly laments in their report is this emotional vulnerability as a masculine strength, and men should be more open and vulnerable with other men and, of course, with their women. Now, I've never been a fan of the word emotional vulnerability. I prefer to use the word authentic or authenticity or the phrase just being real to better describe a man being just emotionally genuine. But again, the APA ignores fundamental differences between men and women, particularly differences in how men and women express emotion. For example, women process experiences emotionally based on how something makes them feel. Hence why they can often have intense mood swings throughout the day as different interactions and situations impact them on emotional level, sudden emotional outbursts, and typically engage in more impulsive behavior because, again, it felt good in the moment. In fact, most men I've worked with in substance abuse who were raised by single mothers and did not have a positive masculine father figure present in their lives display very, very similar behavior. But men, we pride ourselves on being able to control our emotions by being able to stay centered in a sea of emotional turmoil and chaos. In fact, there are dozens of philosophies, disciplines, and practices throughout history to help men master their thoughts and emotions. My two favorite are Marcus Aurelius' Stoicism and Lao Tzu's Taoism. I do think It is a weakness when a man cries over spilt milk, when he whines, blames, and complains because he didn't get his way, or he failed in his endeavor, or things didn't turn out the way he planned. That is absolute weakness, because I believe also that men's tears are special. We shed them when something truly tragic or transformational happens in our lives, when our souls and hearts are truly touched, like when we lose a loved one or when we see our child born. These are special moments for men, and if we hysterically cry over every offense, rejection, and regret, it devalues the specialness of our tears. Another important point the APA highlights as part of this toxic traditional masculinity ideology is adventure and risk. So adventure and risk are necessary ingredients to fulfill a man's soul. We love it, we crave it, we seek it whenever possible. It's what has led men to discover new worlds and conquer new land. Adventure and risk are written into the hearts and soul of men. Any experiences where you almost died are the most exciting. They make the best story. I mean, take a moment to think back right now to one of these experiences. Was it scary? Hell yeah, it was. Did you think you were going to make it? Maybe, maybe not. But you did. You survived. Do you still remember the exhilarating feeling of that adventure, of that risk you felt? Yeah. Because again, adventure and risk are something that fuel the masculine heart and soul. We absolutely love it. It's of high value to us. But again, the APA pathologizes men's innate desire to live a life of adventure and risk. And they also neglect that women are aroused by and attracted to adventurous men who take risks. It makes them wetter than monsoon season in Thailand. The last piece I want to highlight in the APA's definitions of masculinity ideology is violence. So in their guidelines, the APA frequently highlights violence as an inherent danger of traditional masculinity ideology, but they ignore several critical points that I think are very, very valid to that. First, the APA ignores the context in which violence takes place. Of course, they frequently highlight domestic violence as the primary context for masculine violence, neglecting to mention how men also use violence to protect women, children, and even men against usually other violent men. Violence can be used for good just as it can be used for evil, and if it is used, it should be used judiciously. It all depends on the context in which it is used, and the APA completely ignores this. Secondly, the APA ignores how both men and women have the capacity for violence, as well as ignoring the differences between how men and women express violence and aggression towards others. So men are more overt about their aggression and violence, while women are more covert. A man will punch you in the face, while a woman will attack your social circle and reputation. A man will often use more lethal forms of violence, while a woman will falsely accuse you of rape. Regardless of how violence manifests itself, regardless who the perpetrator is, what their gender is, the intent behind the action is to cause unjust harm to others. And again, the APA blatantly ignores this fact. The last point I want to make in regards to violence as part of this toxic masculinity ideology is this. A vital way men form relationships with other men is through fighting, through violent play, whether it's real or imaginary. We men, we hunger for a battle to fight. Whether it's a group of boys getting together to kill the dragon or fight the Great War or get in a violent shootout while playing cops and robbers. When men get together to play video games that simulate combat or watch combat sports or brawl with other men either in the parking lot or on the school playground. All of these are expressions of a man's innate desire for a meaningful battle to fight. And I've made a couple friends after we have fought each other. You know, we hated each other at first, threw some fists, we became friends, and maybe some of you also made good friends this way too. And when we men give each other a good fight, whether in the arena or on the playground, Even if we don't become friends afterwards, there is often a degree of respect and sportsmanship that reflects the warrior spirit within all men. It is the honor and respect for combat, because combat is dangerous. So while the APA's new guidelines are more or less an ideological report disguised as well-founded and supported research, there is actually one guideline number 5, I genuinely fully support, which focuses on the positive impact fathers have on the cognitive, emotional, and academic development of children. In the application of this guideline, the APA encourages active play between fathers and their children, as father-child play, quote, has a functional element correlated with several positive child outcomes, such as competitiveness without aggression, cooperation that buffers anxiety, healthy experimentation, social competence, peer acceptance and popularity, and a sense of autonomy. Great. I absolutely support fathers being more actively involved in play with their children. Play is super critical for a child's psychological and emotional development, and far too many children these days generally do not get enough play, but they are especially starving for quality play with both parents. Parents playing with their children is a win-win situation for everyone that I fully support, and I am pleased the APA at the very least acknowledged the importance of engaged fathers have on the development and growth of children. In conclusion, it's apparent from the language and nuanced concepts contained within the APA's guidelines that they view boys and men as defective girls and women. And we men are in dire need of some re-education and behavior modification programming to condition that toxic masculinity right out of us all. The APA's practicing guidelines regarding psychological practice with boys and men are very concerning, especially, again, given the scope and breadth of the APA's power to influence policy and engineer significant societal changes through research, testing, and behavioral modification programs, which will affect boys across the United States. I do believe these APA guidelines are foreshadowing a pretty egregious agenda because it views boys, men, and traditionally masculine values, principles, roles, and behaviors as a widespread mental health issue and a public health crisis. Naturally, this arouses my curiosity about why the APA is publishing these guidelines. I'm curious if this is part of a social experiment. Again, these people are testers and researchers to see how people will react before these guidelines and what kind of pushback they can anticipate before they actually implement them into standards of practice and policy. I am also curious how these guidelines relate to the abundance of proposed red flag gun control laws across the nation, which permit law enforcement or family members to petition the state to remove a person's firearms without due process if they make statements, which again is just hearsay, that this person is a danger to themselves or others. Is it too much of a leap to assume that based on these guidelines, men who adhere to traditionally masculine ideologies, roles, and values could be flagged as mentally ill and labeled a potential threat to self or others because of their beliefs? I absolutely think it's possible because the APA guidelines are essentially giving the mental health justification for establishing a legal precedence for gun confiscation from toxic men. It's also important to note that the vast majority of American gun owners are men, not women. It is also important to note, according to the Pew Research, that the vast majority of American gun owners are men, not women. So it goes on to say that approximately 62% of men and 22% of women report they own a gun. So these guidelines, in addition to the proposed red flag laws, directly affect men who are law-abiding gun owners. To me, the APA guidelines on traditional masculinity ideology speaks loudly that masculine men are a clear and present threat to the feminine imperative, to feminist ideology, and the social institutions that support them. I think these guidelines are a counterattack against the countless victories the manosphere has had against the feminist agenda over the last several years, and far too many men taking the red pill and waking up to how they are being manipulated and played by the whole system and are walking off the plantation. Well, guys, that'll about do it for this episode of the Culture War here on the Self-Actualized Man. Thank you again for staying with me to the end. I know it was a long episode, but this information is so critical for me to cover and get out to y'all. I would love to hear your feedback and comments regarding these guidelines and how you think they will impact boys and men across America. Feel free to leave those in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this episode, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this content with your fellow red pill brother. Guys, this information is super important to get out because the radical feminists and social institutions supporting the feminine imperative have just weaponized one of the preeminent psychological associations against boys and men. So spread this information far and wide. Also, don't forget to check out the Self-Actualized Man on Facebook and join a community of like-minded men who are working to optimize their lifestyles and maximize their masculine potential in all areas of life. Keep your head on a swivel, fellas, about how these guidelines are going to be implemented, and until next time, peace.